one of the dangers of giving a talk like this is that I rattle a long list of statistics, and it after a while gets rather tedious. So I was wondering what I could do to keep a lively conversation going, which wouldn't get dull after a little while. So what I thought is maybe give you a sense of our journey in terms of the way Indian policymakers have been thinking about India's economy and its place in the world over the last few years, and also give you a sense of how we think about these issues. That will give you a flavor about how we do problem solving. Many of you here are problem solvers. You run businesses, you're policymakers. So maybe it'll be quite interesting to, in fact, hear back from you about how you solved some of these problems, like how did you deal with COVID and so on. Something that I did in India in some ways, and maybe hear from you later on how you thought about solving some of the same problems. So as we stand, India is at a major turning point, but so is the world economy in multiple ways. As you just heard, and I'm sure you hear it quite often, India is now the world's fifth largest economy in US dollar terms. But let me say that if you adjusted it by purchasing power parity, we already are the world's third largest economy. And even in US dollar terms, we will, in the next 18 months, go past Germany. And then by around 27, 28, we will go past Japan to become the world's third largest economy. Now, admittedly, China and the US are well bigger than us even after that, so that's some distance away. But at least we will be then the world's third largest economy. That doesn't mean that we will be rich. As the world's most populous country, per capita incomes will still be quite low. And so we will continue to aspire to grow at very high rates of growth, because that is absolutely essential for us to be able to deliver the kinds of basic levels of standard of living, create the kinds of jobs we need for what will soon be the world's largest workforce, and so on. So this real game is to sustain a growth rate of something in the range of 8% over long periods of time. Now, that doesn't mean that we can do that in every single year. This game is all about compounding. As things stand, for example, this year, India is going to register a little short of 7% GDP growth rate. Given the situation in the rest of the world, this is a very good growth rate. It'll make us, by some margin, the fastest growing major economy in the world. But nonetheless, the fact is, can we grow faster? And one major constraint in this, as stands right now, is in fact the state of the world economy. As you all know, global growth is collapsing. Not just ours, but the goods exports of virtually every country, China, and pretty much every country is sharply down. So is ours. Our services exports are doing decently well. And we now have almost equal services exports and goods exports. But nevertheless, services exports are still doing okay, but goods exports are down. But in those circumstances, trying to press the accelerator and artificially growing our economy by 8% this year is, in my humble judgment, not a great idea, because it would mean that if we try to force growth, our imports would suddenly spike up. This is not a time, as I said, where we can push exports too hard, and it would cause instability in our external accounts. And this comes to something very at the heart of how we think about the Indian economy. While we want to drive growth, we really want to compound this over 25 years. Because this is going to be a time when over 25 years, where our demographics will be in our favor, but also many other things will fall into, begin to click. One of them being the cumulative impact of almost 30 years of reform. So I'm going to give you a flavor of the way in which we have gone about doing reform, such that we have now at the threshold of this growth boom that we hope to experience. Now, if you came to India about 30 years ago, you will remember India was an economy that was a perpetual underperformer. It was a country that everybody joked, always it was a country which always had a great future, but that future was sort of all the time sort of indefinitely pushed into pushed forward. But the reason for this was, unnecessarily, in my view, after independence, we spent 4.5 decades trying to run a government-dominated, public sector-dominated, socialist model of economic growth based on licenses and permits and a huge amount of bureaucratic control that really held India back. Till in 1991, with the backdrop of the collapse of the Soviet Union, India's own economy faced a massive crisis. And as a result of this crisis, we began to finally reform our economy. Now, in the first phase of the reform of the economy, when we said reform, we almost entirely meant liberalization. So the word liberalization and reform for the first decade or so meant pretty much the same thing. What did that mean? We basically removed the requirements of licenses, permits, and opened out the economy to private investment, to foreign investment, and so on. And this first phase of opening out the economy meant that there was a burst of growth in the mid-90s. Unfortunately, having created this sort of recovery in the economy, the push for further reform kind of slowed down. So ironically, by the end of the 1990s, this growth momentum again began to peter out. So every time you do reforms, you open some space for growth, and that space for growth got used up. Instead, what happened is that this space for growth got used up, but of course, we began to see the limits of just opening out space without having put in place the infrastructure, without having sort of completely cleaned up our regulatory systems. In fact, in many areas, we didn't have regulatory systems. So in the 90s, as we opened up our economy, we got a lot of financial scandals. There was a very famous Harshad Mehta scandal, and there were all kinds of other issues. And so we had to put in place the regulatory mechanisms that an open market-based system created. So from the late 90s, we began to also create these regulatory systems. But for the first time under Prime Minister Vajpayee, we began to think of creating world-class infrastructure. Till that point, whenever anybody offered to create world-class infrastructure in India, the usual naysayers would say, but India is a poor country, why do you need world-class infrastructure? Today, going to India, you'll see the use of digital everywhere. But I remember very clearly when, in the late 90s, when mobile telephony was being pushed, the many naysayers would come and say, India didn't even make it with fixed line. Why are you going for mobile telephony? This is all meant for rich people. But Prime Minister Vajpayee was a visionary. For the first time, he began to argue that, India should begin to think of building metro lines, metros for its cities, to create a golden quadrilateral highway system which is built to global standards. We should have this mobile telephony and, really pump it out across the country. And so for the first time, we began to create these. We also, for the first time, began to do tax reforms, for example. And so a whole bunch of reforms were done, and that generated a period of growth in the early 2000s till about 2006, where India again generated a period of very high growth rates. Ironically, the beneficiary of many of these reforms was Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who, as finance minister, by the way, had done many of the original liberalization of the economy. But unfortunately, as Prime Minister, while he did do many other areas, like, for example, the nuclear deal, etc., the reform agenda under that period was much, much more slow. So the phase of growth that opened out a period of growth began to peter out. And again, just like in the late 90s, by the late 2000s, the momentum of growth again began to peter out, which is a reminder that you have to keep doing reforms. Just doing one phase of reforms is not good enough, because eventually the space it creates peters out. So by around about 2007, 2008, the world got hit by yet another financial crisis. You'll all remember the great financial crisis. But by this time, our own growth momentum was slowing. The response to this slowdown in growth was, at that time, maybe it made sense to do it. Ex post, it may look that it was not a great idea, but at that time, the policymakers of that time essentially went for the approach of pumping up growth by pumping bank credit. And so there was a phase in 2007, 8, 9, 10 of pumping out large amounts of bank credit, which led to a period of corporate growth and investment. But unfortunately, it couldn't be sustained because a lot of a bank pumped investment boom, which artificially kept growth going, would eventually lead to bad loans. And so by 2013, 2014, again, we were in the phase where our banking system was getting rapidly accumulating bad loans, and growth momentum was again slowing. And unlike in the decade before that, global trade was not growing in quite the same pace. So again, the momentum of growth began to slow down. So another phase of reforms had to be done. So what were the reforms that were now done? Well, the first thing that occurred that, look, the initial phase of simply opening out the economy was done, but more or less, not fully done, but more or less done. It had generated growth. It had created a market economy. Some regulatory systems had been set up. Some infrastructure incipiently had been built as well. But what you really needed to do now was to actually begin to do the difficult things, because the easy things had somehow been done. So what were those difficult things that needed to be done? What needed to be done was to create the frameworks for allowing this newly built market economy to function. So what was the things that we needed? We needed to create a macroeconomic anchor in the form of an inflation targeting network, framework. Basically, the problem was India, although we were never Argentina-type high inflation country, we were a country that meant that we would have inflation in the 8 to 12% range. Now, having inflation in the 8 to 12% range meant that, of course, your exchange rate kept weakening because you had to keep adjusting for it. And it also meant that interest rates in India, nominal terms at least, always had to be very high. You just couldn't bring down the cost of capital. So somehow you had to create a monetary anchor to inflation. So we introduced a monetary targeting, inflation targeting system, and we said that inflation would be targeted in the 2 to 6% range. Sorry, I'm being a little technical, but these are rather important things, as you will realize shortly. And we created a monetary policy committee, which included the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, but also external members. And since then, this was done in 2015, since then, for the last 8 years, we have managed inflation in this way. And it had been reasonably well run. In fact, inflation has only been outside of this 2 to 6% range on a very few occasions, twice when it went below, and more recently twice when it went above. But by and large, it has remained in this 2 to 6% range. This is important because even in the recent phase, where inflation, not only in developing countries, but many developed countries also went spiking up, our inflation targeting framework actually stood the test of and pressure and remained within this band. So for the very first time, our inflation rate was actually below that of many developed, in fact, most developed countries. This brings a certain macroeconomic credibility that I will come to a little later. But we were doing other framework reforms as well. One of those other big reforms was introduction of GST. Now, why is this a big deal? Well, till we introduced a nationwide GST, we had a peculiar form of indirect tax system where different states had their own indirect tax system. So it was actually more difficult for Mumbai to trade with Delhi than for Mumbai to trade with Shanghai. I mean, if a truck left from Mumbai to go to Delhi, every time it passed through a state boundary, it had to do a lot of paperwork. Not surprisingly, it created lots of opportunities for rent seeking by lower level officials, and it was really difficult. So in 2017, we introduced a nationwide GST system. This was effectively a free trade agreement India signed with itself. Yet another framework reform. In 2016, we introduced something called the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. So for the first time, we created a system by which companies that went bankrupt, which is a natural expectation if you have a market-based economy, if you're expecting people to take risks, you expect some of it to go wrong. But remember, before this, we didn't even have a system of allowing failed companies to basically die. We had something instead called we had something like a warehouse called BIFR, where these dying companies would be sent, and with some vague idea that they could be nursed back to health. But in fact, in most cases, this could not be done. And so you had this warehouse with these large number of half-dead companies kept alive with state support. And many of them were producing products which had already had no market because they were outdated. And yet, taxpayers' money was used to keep them alive. So the first time, we began to have, through the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, a system of actually allowing failed companies to die out. Now, why was all of this important? Because we could finally begin to create the pieces for a truly entrepreneurship-based, risk-taking, startups. All of these things could now be done. We had a domestic market which we could finally use, and we had macroeconomic stability that we had finally anchored. All of this has been done in relatively recent times. And with the help of all of this, we began to clean up our banks. I mentioned to you that in the phase 2007 to 2010, we had tried to pump up growth by pumping our banking system, and it had caused our banks to all get huge amounts of NPAs. So starting 2017, using this new Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, we also began to clean up our banks. In fact, I was personally very much involved in this banking cleanup. And it has been successful enough that despite the shock of COVID, Indian banks today are more healthy and profitable and have lower NPAs than they even had before COVID. We must be the only country in the world which must be true. So here we are in 2023 with an economy where the financial system is actually in very healthy state, in state of really rude health. We have cleaned it up very, very substantially. Pretty much most of the banks are profitable. We have an internal market and a GST system. By the way, introducing a GST system is, as any country that has attempted to do it will know, is always a very painful thing, but we went through that phase, and it's a system that may not be perfect, but is undoubtedly a dramatic improvement on whatever existed before. And many other small reforms were also done. But while we were doing all of this, of course, we got hit by COVID. And this was not an easy thing for anybody, or anybody in this room. Everybody in this room will have faced the sort of chaos that happened as a result of COVID. But even here, India took a very different approach to dealing with COVID than pretty much every other country. Most policymakers around the world looked on COVID as a demand shock, and they dealt with it with a grand plan of using Keynesian approach to try and revive their economies using stimulus checks or whatever else happened to be in specific countries. India actually took a very different approach to dealing with COVID, for which we were criticized a lot in 2020. Some of you will remember that, but has turned out to be eventually the far better way of doing it. So let me describe this, because as I said, I was partly responsible for it. So let me tell you the thinking process behind it so that you understand what we were doing. So if you go back to March of 2020, what is the information that we had about COVID? Pretty much nothing. We did not know what is the kind of virus that was spreading. We did not know exactly what the impact that would be. We didn't know what kinds of people would be impacted. We got relatively very limited information from WHO. You'll remember that. All that we could tell is that something bad had happened in China and that it had spread to northern Italy. And we had all these WhatsApp images, which all of you saw, of people suddenly walking and collapsing and so on. And so, not surprisingly, we called in our own virus experts, like every other government in the world. And they told us that a whole range of things. So there were one group of people who told us, well-known virus experts who told us that this was nothing much more than a bad flu and that we shouldn't worry at all. And then on the other end of the spectrum was others who told us we are all going to die. So now, as you can imagine, how do we respond to a situation where the experts are giving you the full range of possible outcomes? And every country in the world would have faced this. So now how do you deal with this? So different countries took different approaches to this. So there were some countries who went for a full-on lockdown and with a grand isolationist plan, China being one of them, but some of the other countries also did that. And then there were other countries that went for a completely open approach, like Sweden, the Swedish model, for example. Now the problem in India is that we knew that given the sheer number of people and also the limitations of a democratic system, once we had taken a particular path, we were stuck with it. We couldn't change direction. So what do you do? So what we did was effectively to carry out a full lockdown in the beginning. This is not because we didn't understand that this was going to be a painful thing to do, but basically we were buying time for ourselves. And we also took the view that this was a supply-side shock. This is an intellectual difference with almost every other country in the world. Every other country in the world saw it as a demand shock. We said, no, the people want to spend money, but we have shut everything down. There's no avenue to spend money. We don't let them go to the mall. We don't let them go to open the restaurant. So this is a supply shock. And therefore, handing large amounts of money to people makes no difference. All you will do is use up your ammunition with no impact on the economy. It will be like pressing the accelerator with your foot on the brake. So we decided that under those circumstances, we were not actually going to carry out these large stimulus efforts, even though, as I said, there were Nobel laureates telling us to do otherwise. There were international media, national media telling us, where is the large packages, etc. Instead, we did relatively small, medium-sized packages, iteratively. Why? When you cannot see into the fog, what do? You drive carefully rather than have one grand plan. And instead of going and spending a huge amount of money, instead we invested in safety nets. So what did we do? We said, look, let's make sure that nobody starves. So 800 million people were provided free food if they asked for it. So it was made available. Not everybody turned up for it, but 800 million people had a safety net of food. Then because we had created before this Jan Dhan Aadhaar, i.e. a unique identification and linked to everybody's bank accounts, and we had information on income levels from that through something, and these accounts for poor people called Jan Dhan accounts. We transferred relatively small amounts of money to them. We were fully aware that this was not going to revive the economy. But that was not our purpose. All we were doing was providing a safety net. Similarly, what we did is that we went to the business community. They said, oh my God, all the cash flow is going to jam up, so we will suddenly have a payments problem. Now again, this is something all other countries faced. What did they do? They gave out stimulus checks again. They guaranteed salaries and gave all kinds of things. These are very expensive things to do. Instead, India basically guaranteed 80% of the payments in the system, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses. Now, basically what is happening here is, all we are doing is stopping a cascade of defaults going through the payment system of the economy. Basically, we are avoiding a situation where I can't pay him, he can't pay her, she can't pay me, and we all go bust. All I'm doing is, we guaranteed that the government will pay 80% of the money even if somebody goes bust. As it turns out, because we had guaranteed the payments in the entire system, very, very few people actually went bust. And because very, very few people actually went bust, for a fraction of the money, we managed to keep the entire payment system and the financial system afloat. We didn't need to go and spend large amounts of money on stimulus checks, which meant that by the end of 2020, unlike almost any other country, we had both the fiscal and monetary space to actually begin to pump demand as we came out of the first wave. Now, meanwhile, we got hit by a second wave, which was the Delta wave, which did have a large human cost. But we, by this point in time, were reasonably confident of a few things. So although there were the shock of Delta, and it did kill many people, we were confident of a few things. One, we knew by this point that a vaccine was on the way, and we were going to roll it out. And while most people at that time didn't have the confidence of it, we did eventually roll out vaccines for a billion odd people twice. We knew that by this point that this virus did not affect younger people, which was very important. We didn't know this in the beginning, but it was very important. We knew that it wouldn't wipe out our children. So it meant that we could target the kinds of people who we needed to support, which tended to be the older people, people with comorbidities. And so we knew how much quarantining capabilities we needed. And so by May 2021 or thereabouts, we were reasonably confident with the vaccine program being rolled out, and finally we having our grip on, oxygenators and the Delta wave as well. We were reasonably confident that the time had come to really get the economy out. So from that point onwards, we began to roll in this extra fiscal space we had into a huge infrastructure build-out, which we have been now doing for over 2 years. Those of you who visit India will visibly see the huge amount of new infrastructure that is being rolled out. The sheer scale of it is now, in what used to be considered to be only possible in places like China. So, for example, a couple of months ago, we built 100 kilometers of highway in 100 hours. Similarly, and I keep quoting this, and I did the other way as well, the largest concentration of cranes in the world today is in Mumbai. We are building in Delhi alone, for example. Delhi in 2009 did not have a metro station. It already has, by the way, the world's third largest metro network. And by the end of this decade, we will probably be the second or first largest metro network in the world. So the sheer scale of this build-out of infrastructure that is happening is truly mind-boggling, and we intend to keep doing this well past this decade. Obviously, the first build-out is happening in the larger cities, and Mumbai and Delhi and so on are the beneficiaries of this. But at every stage, you will find that the scales in which we are thinking is, as I said, at a cutting edge of the world. This is the ambition we had, which we didn't till very, very recently tended to have. So, for example, in Delhi, you visit Delhi, you will see that there is a fairly large airport today, but to the immediate east of the city, on the way to Agra, we are building yet another one, which again will be one of the world's largest airports. Mumbai is building a brand new airport in Navi Mumbai, which will also be one of the largest airports in the world. And both these airports, the Delhi one, I think, will be finished in 30 months. The one in Mumbai, maybe in 36 to 40 months. So these are the kinds of rollouts. In Mumbai, for example, building 13 new metro lines at the same time. And much of this will be on stream in the next 20 months. The main line, the arterial line of this, line number 3, when it opens in about a year's time, will be on day one the world's most heavily used metro line. It will be the busiest metro line in the world on day one. So this is the kind of large-scale infrastructure that we are rolling out. And of course, we are not just building infrastructure, we are now beginning to push in every field. In science, for example, you'll be aware that we recently landed on the dark side of the moon, and we have now sent another mission to the sun. We are doing this in many other fields as well. The reason I gave you this sort of overview is so that you have a flavor of the kinds of things we are doing today. But of course, we want to sustain this over the next 25 years, which means that we need to keep doing these kinds of reforms for the next 25 odd years. So what are the kinds of reforms we will do over the next 25 odd years? Well, most of the infrastructure that we have built in recent times and are building right now is about interconnecting our cities. So we have dramatically upgraded our highways. We are now investing in our railways. In fact, this year, we sharply increased the budget of the railways. And just yesterday, our railway minister, Ashwini ji, tweeted about the new designs of our trains and sleepers that we are going to have. These are, again, dramatically more modern than what we had all this while. But, you know, similarly with airports and so on. But the next round of investment that we are going to do is to be not the interconnections between our cities, but in the intra-city infrastructure. This is where the biggest problem now is in our cities. So our cities, while they're getting interconnected faster and faster, the infrastructure inside our cities, however, is not up to speed, very frankly. And here, the city I live in Delhi, for example, we are completely changing the center of the city where all the government offices are. As you may be aware, we have just inaugurated a brand new parliament, replacing our old parliament, which was, of course, an iconic building, but we have a brand new state-of-the-art parliament. But we are going to do this with pretty much all our government offices. Those of you who have visited India and had to suffer, for example, Shastri Bhavan, will hopefully in a year or so be able to visit a completely modern building. And by the way, we are doing it everywhere. Look at this particular High Commission complex. Those of you who have visited the earlier one will know that we have clearly begun to think in a different scale and level altogether. And we are going to have to do this with all our government offices, including mine will hopefully eventually get torn down. But of course, we will also preserve some of the best things from the past. So, for example, right now, you have South Block and North Block on Raisina Hill. Those are beautiful old colonial buildings. We don't want to tear those down, so we're going to move our Foreign Office, our Finance, Home Ministry, Prime Minister's Office, and our Defense Ministry, which are on the Raisina Hill. We're going to give them state-of-the-art brand new offices. And North Block and South Block are going to be converted into museums, our National Art Museum and National History Museum, and the entire space is going to be made open to public, so that in the middle of the city, you have an open space for everybody the public in general to participate. And just in the last 1 year, we have also upgraded the entire central vista, which is what used to be called Rajpath, but now called Kartavya Path, all the way through to India Gate, and completely opening it out in a upgraded and refreshed to the public. So you can see that we are doing this step by step across the country. In Mumbai, you may be familiar with the Queen's Necklace or Marine Drive. We are extending that for 22 kilometers on the western coast of Mumbai. Again, it will transform the city completely. So you'll have this road running along the sea with all kinds of facilities, restaurants, places for play, and so on. So what we are doing basically is a complete facelift of the country, which is not something that we are saying theoretically. Many of these things will be coming on stream in 12 months, 20 months, 30 months. Some of these things, of course, it means that living in India right now feels like living in a construction zone. But this construction is real. If you go to a tall building in Delhi or Mumbai, you can see much of this construction being rolled out on a very large scale. So this is one thing that we intend to keep doing, build out the infrastructure, upgrade our cities. Another very big area of reform that we need to do is process reform. So I talked earlier about structural framework reforms, but much of what we are now doing is process reforms. Taking processes in a given framework and improving it substantially. So I'll give you some examples of things that I'm personally working on. Take our patent system. So India wants to, we want to be in the knowledge economy. And yet, till 2016, India used to only grant 9,000 patents a year. Now that number has, this year, risen to something like 36,000 patents, which we will do this year. Now, from 9,000 to 36,000 may sound like a very large jump, but let me put it in context. The US does 350,000 patents a year. China does 500,000 patents a year. Now, even if one discounts the fact that China's utility-based patent system, not all the patents are great, but even then, if you look at the decent quality patents, something around 100,000 patents a year, good quality patents a year come out of China. Now, we have to compete in that universe. We can't do it with our current system. So what are we doing? Well, there is a huge effort right now being made by our patent office to upgrade our systems using AI. We are hiring this year, just in the next few weeks, we will be hiring 500 new examiners, and we will be doing large numbers into the next few years, for which numbers have already been sanctioned. And the idea is that in 18 months' time, our processing power of our patent office will go up to 100,000. So in less than a decade, in 2016, I said we were doing 9,000 patents. We are doing now 35 to 40,000 patents. In 18 months' time, we will have the capacity to do 100,000 patents. And this is already in the way. It's not something we're thinking of doing. We are already doing the hiring. We are already changing the processes, and so on. This is just one example of the fact that we are thinking in a completely different scale of changing our processes. Another big area of reform that we intend to do, reforming our legal system. Now, this is not something that can be done easily or done by the government alone, because obviously the judiciary has to be brought on board with this. But we certainly need, if you want to be a market-based economy, enforcement of contracts, and this done on time. And everybody knows the Indian legal system is notoriously slow. So again, a big public debate is now happening on how to go about doing this. And the Indian government and the judiciary are now beginning to think of ways in which we can begin to change this. It won't happen overnight, but we are roughly where we were about a decade ago when we were discussing GST. So at some point in time in the next few years, the machinery will finally begin to do those reforms. And similar things will happen also in the Indian administrative system, in the bureaucracy. Those discussions, serious discussions, thinking, public debate is finally beginning to happen. In India, after all, we are a democracy. Before change happens, there is a phase of debate, discussion, and argument. That is usually a good thing, because eventually, that once the wheels begin to get going, we do eventually begin to do those reforms. And I can see that those are now the debates that we are having. Before the end of the decade, you'll begin to see these new reforms happening. The judiciary, the administrative, and the bureaucracy, these reforms will begin to happen. So what I tried to do here is to give you a flavor of how we are thinking about the world, how we are doing reforms today for generating the next round of growth. Because as I showed you, simply doing one round of growth doesn't give you growth. You get some growth and then it dies out. So you need to keep doing reforms, you need to keep building infrastructure and capacity. And that is what we are doing, looking into the future. But this is almost all of what I said relates to the domestic economy. There has also been a significant change in the way India perceives the world. And this may be the bit that may be something that you already feel. The way we engage with the world has quite distinctly changed. In that, instead of being perpetual whiners about the rest of the world, we have begun to engage with it in our own terms. But this is something we do want here to reach out to like-minded partners around the world. Because this is not about rewriting the rules of the world for India's own interests. We want to do this for all our partners, whether it is in Africa or in the Indian Ocean world, or in the Indo-Pacific. These are various formats and frameworks that we use now increasingly to think about our engagement with the world. And what is important here is that Mauritius falls into all of these frameworks. It is an Indian Ocean country. It is an Indo-Pacific country. It is an African country. So in all of these, Mauritius plays an important role. And in all of these frameworks, we feel that we have reached a point where the existing architecture of the way the world is run is clearly breaking down and dissolving. Now, India is a reformist. We are not anarchists. We are not trying to disturb the world for the sake of disturbing the world. But we can see, like all of you can see, that the way the world was functioning is no longer possible to keep it going. So new rules of the world, new architecture needs to be created. And so India wants to play an important part of and role in doing this, not just for itself, as I said, but also as a representative, as I said, for all these other frameworks, including that of the Global South. But also other setups as well, whether it's in the geostrategic world as part of the Quad or I2G, U2, or many other frameworks that we may be a part of. And one of the things we want to do as part of this is to create and participate in creating the rules and narratives for this new world that is emerging. For example, for far too long, the way global finance is set up, how the cost of capital is set up, has been decided by the North Atlantic institutions. All countries in the world end up being rated on sovereign ratings, for example. And yet, what are sovereign ratings? They're opinions of essentially three institutions based in the North Atlantic. Why should the world continue to function where the cost of capital for everybody is decided by three private institutions? Who gave them this right to do it? Were we consulted about it? Why should only they do it? What is the rules and norms against which they will judge us? So given this sort of thought, we in India have decided that we will take it upon ourselves to begin to actually create some of these norms, measures, ways of measuring and monitoring into the future. So for example, on sovereign ratings, there is an Indian rating agency which functions in Mauritius as well, called CareEdge. They may be in this room for all I know. There they are. And they will be coming out. They have already made their methodology public. And in the next 3 to 4 months, they will be issuing sovereign ratings for about 40 countries. In 6 to 7 months, they will be doing 100 countries. So for the first time, a country from the Global South will be issuing sovereign ratings for the world. Now, I'm sure there are countries in Africa, in the Indian Ocean world, which may be interested in partnering this. If you wish to create sovereign ratings for yourself, we will be very happy to help you generate them. If you want to understand our methodology or way of going about it, I'm sure CareEdge will be very pleased to sit with you and sort of help you sort of be a part of this journey. The same thing is true, for example, on something called ESG norms, so environment, social, and governance norms. If you don't know what these are, let me tell you, you will soon have your lives being run by these norms, because effectively, these are being imposed systematically in every international forum, whether it's investment or trade. And yet, these ESG norms have not been debated anywhere. They have not been defined anywhere. This whole approach was mooted in a discussion paper by a UN agency in 2006. In that discussion paper, nobody told us what those norms will be, who will monitor it. Effectively, what has happened is that slowly through creeping creeping forward, again, a tiny group of think tanks, NGOs, and consultancies, again based in the North Atlantic, have come to define these ESG norms. They have appointed themselves as the purveyors and monitorers of these norms, and to give out certificates, usually on payment of a fee, to whoever from the rest of the world may want to be monitored. Now, what has happened as a result of this is that we have ended up, again, introducing new norms and new rules for global finance and global trade, to which nobody was a party to. These norms are given to us and we have to participate in them. Yet again, we in India have decided that we are going to push back against that. We will create new norms. We will monitor it for you. If any other country in the world wants to take this up, we are very happy to share our expertise, share our technology, and to partner you in creating new norms and create new ways of doing things. To give you one example of the absurdity of some of these norms based on which, by the way, the cost of capital or finance or trade negotiations happen, I'll give you the example. There is something called a democracy index. And this is issued, interestingly, by an agency in Sweden called Varieties of Democracy Institute, VDEM Institute. It's a very well-known institute. And this institute gives out certificates to the rest of the world on how good their democracy is. Now, it may interest you to know that India, the world's largest democracy in this ranking, comes out in the late 90s. So if I forget, it's something like 96 or something like that, our ranking is. Mauritius shouldn't feel too pleased. I don't think your ranking is terribly good on this either. Neither is the US. But who are the countries that look good in this democracy index is also very instructive. The first several countries in the democracy index are the following: the Kingdom of Norway, the Kingdom of Denmark, the Kingdom of Sweden, the Kingdom of Belgium, the Commonwealth of New Zealand, the Commonwealth of Canada, the United Kingdom. The main finding basically of the VDEM index is that being a kingdom is good for democracy. Now, this is a clear, absurd finding. But you have many such indices that are pumped out. There is something called a happiness index as well. Right? Now, please do this following exercise. The happiness index is strongly correlated, by the way, also to the suicide rates in those countries. I'm not joking about this. It is also highly correlated by use of antidepressants. So again, this happiness index is widely used, by the way. You may you think it's a joke, but it's widely used. But the happiness index basically tells us that if you kill off, or rather the unhappy kill themselves off and the rest of us use antidepressants, you become a happy country. And while these are absurd indices, you may think it is quite harmless and pointless, but in fact they're not. Because all these strange indices slowly find themselves into something called the World Bank's World Governance Indicator. And with the stamp of the World Bank's World Governance Indicator, they end up in your sovereign ratings. You can check this methodology. I've written papers on this. That's on the Prime Minister's Economic Council website. And so, your cost of capital is decided by this utter absurdity. And yet, countries in the global south have had very little way of pushing back against it. Till we in India have decided that enough is enough, and we are now taking these up on a sustained basis. We are writing down these methodologies, poking holes in them, but most importantly, we are now going to begin to do them ourselves with methodologies that are better. But as I said, this is not a journey just for India. This is a partnership for many other countries, not just in the global south. There are many, even in the West, who understand that these matrices are absurd. I mean, in the US, there is a large lobby of thinkers and companies, etc., who have pushed back against the absurdity that the highest ranking in many of these ESG matrices, interestingly, is not Tesla, as you may think, clean energy and all that. In fact, it is a middling country on ESG rankings. The highest ranked country on all these ESG rankings, you'll be interested to know, is Philip Morris, cigarette company. Manages to get carbon credits for the growing of tobacco, which is evidently quite a green activity. I'm able to stand here and say all of this is because all of this is well documented. It's not something I discovered. You can actually Google this information up. And yet, we have had this situation. Now, I'm making a big deal of this because I think this is just one space about how the rules of the game in this new emerging world has to be rethought. But I also want to make it also clear, like our Foreign Minister Jaishankarji pointed out just last week, being non-Western doesn't mean that India is anti-Western. We just want a fair set of rules, which is transparent and applicable to everybody else. We are happy to participate in writing these rules. In fact, all of you should participate in it, in writing these rules. And once we have a fair system, there should be also a fair system of monitoring these rules. Because once a relatively fair system of application of rules and so on is built out, then we will then move to a new equilibrium that will replace the old one, an equilibrium that started out in the 19th century, got reset once just after the Second World War, reset a second time in the early 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it's clearly that cycle is now coming to an end. But hopefully a new cycle of prosperity and growth will emerge, and we hope that India will be a very important part of that. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sanyal, for a very, very enlightening lecture. In fact, I'm full of questions today. I think we have about 15 to 20 minutes. I think we need short replies to each of this. I think the first question is, once African Union has been added into the G20, in what way India's learnings can be used and be taken forward for African countries? A few prescriptions. This is from Yash Menon from MTEL.
Well, first of all, it'll be quite interesting to decide whether or not it now gets called G21. But I think the key thing here is that, first of all, it now becomes truly representative of the world. It also means that the G20 is now, in some ways, the real platform for global conversations. It should have been the UN, Maybe it should have been some other multilateral platform. But the G20 is where this conversation happens. But this does not mean that many of the existing multilateral frameworks can be wished away. You still need the WHO. You do have the IMF World Bank meeting next week only in Marrakesh. The hope is that Africa will now, with its large membership, and most of these countries are also members of these multilateral agencies, that we can have a serious discussion about really updating and upgrading these multilateral institutions. Many of them are semi-moribund, WTO or whatever. I mean, now these issues have gone beyond being polite. We now need to either revive these institutions, or if they're not fit for purpose for the 21st century, then let's close them down. Okay. But there has to be some honest discussion. And as I said, by bringing Africa into it, it means a large number of members of these, but also a new, very important voice, that can be brought to bear in these discussions about the new architecture that will emerge. Because clearly the old architecture, the old international organizations and platforms, these have, some of them have clearly outlasted their whatever their utility was.
Okay, thank you. This second question is from Mrs. Sadhana Gopal from CZ, Second Deputy Governor of Bank of Mauritius. What is your views on BRICS, and do you think that it will be still able to meet its objectives?
Difficult question. This should hand it to the MEA. I'll just give my personal views on this. My view is that BRICS was set up they were the original 4 countries. It started out basically as an acronym, and then it added South Africa to it, and now it's added a whole bunch of new countries. It is certainly a very different kind of mix of countries which wouldn't exist in any other way. Because, if you take any of the others, they are there for a certain reason, like Quad or something, or any of the others. There's a relatively clear purpose to its existence. You're right. What is the purpose of BRICS going forward with this combination? Now, the answer to that question, personally, I am not 100% clear how this will evolve. And maybe that is part of the joy of it. But it does mean that there is now a combination of countries what would have been impossible to bring together in any other way, because, many of these countries, for example, have other geostrategic conflicts. For example, India and China have a border issue. But it also trades. India's second largest trading partner is also China. It has, South Africa and Brazil. So there are, and by the way, many of these are also in the G20. So it's creating different combinations of interests, etc., for a world that is, at least for now, a multipolar world. So if you live in a multipolar world, you can end up with the Cold War with, clear 2 boxes. Or what I think we are ending up with is with interlocking groups of countries which have different interests, may collaborate in one universe, may compete in another universe. And I think in some ways, this is where the world is going. So in that sense, the BRICS provides a brick that would not otherwise exist in any other way than it does with BRICS.
The next question is from Mr. Kevin Ram Kolan. In fact, he's from Business Mauritius, and this is something of your interest whenever I've heard you. A long-term plan relies on a strong education, skilling the ecosystem. How is India planning to do that in terms of agile, digital, and collaborative labor? And also, in a future, how to cut, when there will be job losses will be there, and what sort of new skills which will be required?
So this is actually a very important question, because several things will happen simultaneously. One is that we will have to do this skilling at a time when all kinds of disruptive technologies are also emerging, AI or whatever it is. So many of the jobs that our existing education systems are set up to do may or may not exist in the future. So what are we training these people for? First of all, so fast changing. Two, the sheer scale of it, the hundreds of millions of people we need to educate in a relatively short period of time. And the fact that the existing system is already overburdened on this. So how do you do this? Now, I'm going to talk, for brevity, I will talk about the higher education problem. Because this is where skilling, and so we're basically dealing with people who are 16 to 21 age group. Now, historically, the idea was that they would all go to university, they would be educated by, go to lecture theaters and be educated and be given a degree at the end of it. But frankly, we cannot build those universities fast enough. We do not know what those universities should be built for, as I mentioned. So what do we do? So this is a world where it is very clear to me at least that we will have to rethink higher education in a very fundamental way, such that we do not get into the trap of spending the next 30 years building old-style universities, when by the time we have finished it, we have also, our demographic boom is also over and we have these empty universities we don't know what to do with, like the South Koreans are finding out. So one way of doing this is that for many, many subjects, you actually do not need live classrooms. In fact, what is the purpose that the same lecture is repeatedly given by thousands of people in thousands of classrooms, and what you really need to do is to find the best guy to give the best lecture and put it on YouTube. In fact, that's what people are doing anyway. And then get the universities to focus away from lecturing to testing and research. So basically, get education institutions to focus on the testing of the knowledge and on creating new knowledge, rather than on lecturing, which is mostly what universities today do. Now, what is the advantage of this is, firstly, we don't need to build so many universities. Two, because I don't have to retrain so many teachers, I just have to put in a new set of lectures every time the subject changes, upgrades, etc. And I just need to change the testing system. I can be radically more agile than I would have been if I had built universities, educated a faculty, and gone about doing it. And because now lecturing, going to university, etc., is no longer linked to getting of degrees, certifications, etc., it allows me to do all kinds of things. For example, people can do multiple courses in any combination they wish, because they can, there's no limits to classrooms. Similarly, they can do courses that, in combinations that they couldn't do otherwise. We can have adult education in any which way. You could be an accountant for 20 years, get bored, go back to becoming an economist, do that for a while, get bored, and become a lawyer. And so we have to get into creating a new kind of digitally enabled education. And yes, some classroom effort may be needed for projects and so on, but the fact is we can now disaggregate it very substantially onto digital platforms.
Thank you. The next question is from Bloomberg News. India has recorded weakest monsoon this year. What will be the impact in terms of inflation, and what does it mean in terms of export restriction food products?
Well, the monsoon hasn't quite finished, in the sense that there is still, the monsoon was weak, but it is also extended. So it's still raining in India, many parts, as you may be aware. The impact, there may be some impact on food production, but the numbers aren't in yet. But let me be very clear that India's food stocks are more than adequate to be able to deal with it. And so while we are monitoring the situation as it evolves, I think our food situation, domestically at least, is not in any major stress. We do get seasonal spikes in tomato prices, etc. We recently had a spike in tomato prices, but they are now back to normal levels. So those spikes happen, but by and large, is there a major food security issue? No. As far as restrictions and other things to the rest of the world, well, that will evolve as things move. But we will be responsible about going about it.
Thank you. The next question is from the South African High Commission, Mr. Maliwa Madingwane. You talked in the EDV conference that, and tonight, that India's growth is in dollar rate, been pretty high, but India is a poor country. I mean, how does India reconcile with that? I know you have talked about it a lot.
Well, it's not too difficult to see. We have a high growth rate, but from a very low level of per capita income. I mean, India's average Indian is still below $3,000 a year. And, even when we get to $5,000 a year, we are hardly a rich country. But what it will do, however, is that the extreme forms of poverty, extreme poverty that was there, that is now quite distinctly falling. And whether it's the World Bank or our own measures, multi-dimensional measures of poverty suggest that there has been very substantial declines in absolute poverty in India. And that is important because, you can aspire to do many other things. You can have this demographic dividend and so on. But if you have such a large part of your population that is basically doesn't have enough to eat or doesn't have enough clothes or doesn't have basic shelter, then you can't really leverage this population to do anything substantial. So we are, thankfully, this growth that we are generating is removing that very extreme kind of poverty quite at a very good clip. Now we need to sustain this to remove it completely. We haven't done it yet. But I can say, and here I think there is something to be said about the African experiences as well. There is too much talk very often from so-called development economists and development experts who will come and give long lectures that, growth is not good enough, that in fact we shouldn't focus on growth. It should all be about various kinds of, redistribution projects or government schemes and other such things. Yes, some of that may be necessary. I have no problem with those. But let me say that growth is a necessary condition. It may not always be sufficient, but it is a necessary condition for removing poverty and for creating jobs. And this is why a single-minded focus on generating growth is absolutely necessary. Do not let any expert in the world come and dissuade you from this focus.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Mr. Amit Gupta of AMG Group. This is about your favorite project of this stitched ship. I think he wants to know a little more about it.
Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about the stitched ship for those who are completely puzzled about what it is. As you heard earlier, Madam High Commissioner also mentioned that I have a passion for maritime history, particularly the history of the Indian Ocean. And India has something like a 5,000-year history of maritime trade and exploration in the Indian Ocean. After all, we are the only country which has an ocean named after it. And this, all this maritime trade and exploration done by ancient Indians has even today a huge amount of impact. I mean, the biggest Hindu temple in the world is not in India, it's in Cambodia. And there's enormous, for example, Korean history begins with the marriage of a Korean prince to a princess from Ayodhya in India. So there's a huge amount of evidence of this maritime trade. But the question is, how was this trade actually carried out? Now, do not be under the impression that these were very small, some heroic merchant in a ship going out. Maybe in the very beginning that was like that. But certainly by the classical period, the Gupta period, this was an industrial scale activity. There were hundreds of ships going from a west coast towards the Red Sea and then trading with the Mediterranean world. And there were hundreds of ships going eastward to Southeast Asia and all the way to China and Japan. And this trade was done by corporatized guilds, which are almost like multilateral companies, and they were funded by these temple banks. So there is all these legends of these large Indian temples with huge amounts of gold in it, and sometimes people get the impression this happens because the Indian kings were handing over their money to the banks. Let me tell you, that is not the case. Getting money off Indian politicians was difficult even in those days. The reason they had such a lot of gold is because they functioned as banks. And they made their money from financing, from venture capital and lending to merchant guilds that were doing these great voyages out to Southeast Asia, to Red Sea, to the Persian Gulf, and even to east coast of Africa. But what were the ships they were using for doing this? So it turns out that they built these very peculiar kinds of ships that are very different from the European ships, for example, in which Vasco da Gama and other came. So these ships were, for a variety of reasons, not nailed together, but stitched together using a peculiar design. And so one of the things that I wanted to do, and now I have the support of the Ministry of Culture and the Indian Navy to do it, fortunately, is to build one of these ancient ships. And these were not small ships. So I'm now building a ship which is about 64 feet long, reasonably large ship by ancient standards. And we're going to build it using this ancient stitch technique based on a painting from the 5th century in Ajanta caves. And we're going to use only the ancient systems, what we can recreate of the system of stitching it together. We're going to use all the square sails. We're not going to use a rudder because rudder had not been invented. We're going to have a trailing oar. And we're going to try and see, to the extent we can, use the stars to do the navigation. And so the ship is now being built. We have started construction in Goa just last month. And the idea is to take 18 months to build it, then 6 months of testing. And finally, I hope to sail this from Odisha coast in eastern India all the way to Bali in Indonesia and beyond.
Thank you.
This expected to do it in end of 2025.
The next question is from a banker, Mr. Abrar Anwar. He is the CEO of Standard Chartered Bank. He's talking about India's deficit in trade export and the Africa opportunity. This is something which you have always been talking about, and I think perhaps very, very meaningful from this point of view. How can how can India trade with Africa and, increase its trade?
So there are two parts to it. One is about what should it trade in and so on. And there are businessmen in this audience, and I am against the idea of the state going out there and telling business what it should trade. That's your job, not mine. But what we can do from our side is facilitate it in various ways by, first of all, simply building the physical infrastructure. At least on our side, I can tell you, Indian ports and Indian airports and other things are being constructed, as I said, to the very best in the world. Not so long ago, JNPT, which is one of our largest ports, used to take 7 days to turn around a ship. As of last week, it now takes 22 hours. And this is still far away from being Singapore, which takes only 6 hours. But we are getting there. Our airports, meanwhile, are the best in class. We are even better than Changi in terms of Bangalore Airport has the fastest turnaround time of any airport in the world. We are better even than Chinese or even Singapore. 6 hours from factory gate to the time the aircraft takes off. So first of all, we are building the physical infrastructure. In the specific case of Africa, of course, we're going to do a big outreach. One of these outreaches on the financial side. We are, as you say, making it easier to denominate in Indian rupees, make payments in Indian rupees. We are very open to sharing our payment systems, the UPI, and so on. We have a financial messaging system, which, even if we say it ourselves, is better than SWIFT. We're happy to share it with you. It's called SFMS, and we have used it now for more than 10 years inside India. And we're happy to share that technology with you. So basically creating the infrastructure, financial infrastructure, the physical infrastructure for trade. And of course, let me also say that a lot of this trade is not going to be in goods. The world economy is rapidly becoming more service-oriented, and we will be there in software. We will be there both as a destination for tourists and as a source of tourists. and so on and so forth. So, we look forward to all the partnerships, and the Indian government, I can assure you, will take whatever measures needed to promote it.
Thank you. In fact, we have many more questions, but because of the paucity of time, possibly we won't be able to take more. But what we will do is we will share it with Mr. Sanyal, and we'll try to see if we can get some responses for you in the next few days. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Now, I have to give the